The Arizona desert in August isn't a place for mistakes, and at 31, I thought I knew better than to make them. I'd been living in Phoenix for about 3 years, working as a freelance photographer, and the outdoors had become my second office. Every weekend I'd hit different trails with my camera, building up my portfolio of southwestern landscapes. When I found the Desert Wanderers group on Facebook, it seemed perfect. Organized hikes to remote locations most tourists never see, with people who actually knew what they were doing. That Saturday morning, I loaded my backpack with what I thought was plenty of water, 3 liters, plus my camera gear, some protein bars, sunscreen, and a lightweight jacket. The group leader, a weathered guy named Frank who'd been hiking these trails for decades, had emphasized bringing extra water, but I figured 3 liters would be more than enough for a 5-hour hike. We met at a gas station off Highway 60 at 5 in the morning, trying to beat the worst of the heat. There were 8 of us total, a mix of experienced hikers and intermediates like myself. Frank went over the route, a 12-mile loop through a canyon system that would take us past some ancient petroglyphs and natural springs. He made everyone show their water supplies, nodding approvingly at most, but raising an eyebrow at mine. 3 liters might be cutting it close, he said, his voice gravelly from years of desert air. But the gas station was already closed, and I assured him I'd be fine, that I'd done plenty of desert hikes before. The first hour was magical, the sunrise painting the rocks in shades of orange and pink that my camera couldn't quite capture, though I tried with every shot. The group moved at a steady pace, and I found myself constantly stopping to photograph the way the light hit the canyon walls. The intricate patterns in the sand, the lonely barrel cacti standing like sentinels against the brightening sky. Around 7:30, we reached a narrow section of the trail where massive boulders created these incredible shadow patterns across the red dirt. I had to get the shot. The contrast was perfect, almost surreal, like nature's own art installation. I told the person nearest to me, a woman named Diane who worked as a nurse in Scottsdale, that I'd catch up in just a minute. She nodded and kept walking, her bright blue pack disappearing around a bend while I crouched down, adjusting my camera settings to capture the interplay of light and shadow. Through my viewfinder, I noticed a side trail leading up to what looked like a natural arch formation about 50 yards away. The morning light was hitting it at just the right angle, creating this golden glow that wouldn't last another 20 minutes. Without really thinking about it, I scrambled up the rocky path, my hiking boots sliding slightly on the loose gravel, determined to get what could be the perfect shot for my portfolio. The arch was even more spectacular up close, and I spent maybe 15 minutes shooting from different angles, completely absorbed in my work. When I finally lowered my camera and looked around, the silence hit me first. No voices, no footsteps on gravel, no sounds of other hikers. The main trail below seemed empty in both directions, and I realized with a quick spike of annoyance that the group hadn't waited for me. I scrambled back down to the main trail, choosing to go right because that's where we'd been heading. But after 10 minutes of quick walking, I still hadn't caught up. The trail split into 2 paths near a cluster of tall saguaro cacti, and I stood there, sweat already beading on my forehead despite the early hour, trying to remember if Frank had mentioned anything about a fork. My phone showed no signal, just a useless emergency calls only message, and I hadn't thought to download offline maps because I was supposed to be with a group the entire time. I chose the left path, reasoning that it seemed more worn, which meant more foot traffic, which meant it was probably the main trail. But after another 20 minutes of increasingly rapid hiking, the path narrowed and started climbing steeply upward. Nothing like the relatively flat loop Frank had described. My first water bottle was already half empty. I'd been sipping constantly in my hurry to catch up, and the temperature was climbing fast. My phone's weather app, one of the few things that worked offline, showed it was already 92 degrees, and it wasn't even 9 o'clock yet. I backtracked to the fork, wasting another 20 minutes and more precious water, then tried the right path. This one seemed more promising at first, winding through a wash with high walls that provided some shade. But after about a mile, it dead-ended at a pile of massive boulders that looked like they'd fallen recently, probably during last month's flash floods. The rational part of my brain said to stay calm, retrace my steps all the way back to where I'd taken the photos, and wait there for the group to notice I was missing and come back for me. But pride and a growing kernel of panic pushed me to keep searching. I climbed up a small ridge to get a better view, hoping to spot the group or at least recognize some landmark from Frank's pre-hike briefing. All I saw was endless desert in every direction. Miles of creosote bushes, ocotillo plants with their spindly arms reaching toward the cloudless sky, and distant mountains shimmering in the heat that was already creating those wavy distortions in the air. My second water bottle was down to a third, and when I checked my phone again, it was 9:47 and showing 101 degrees. The weight of my camera gear, usually barely noticeable, felt like carrying stones in my pack, and my shirt was completely soaked through with sweat that evaporated almost instantly in the dry air. By 11 o'clock, I'd finished my second bottle and was halfway through my third and last one. The temperature on my phone read 109 degrees, and every breath felt like inhaling from a hairdryer. I'd given up on finding the trail and was now focused on basic survival, looking for shade, any shade. But the sun was almost directly overhead, and the scraggly desert plants threw shadows barely bigger than dinner plates. My lips were cracked despite the lip balm I kept applying, and I could feel the beginning of what would become severe sunburn on the back of my neck where my hat didn't quite cover. In the distance, maybe 2 miles away, I could see power lines cutting across the desert, and I knew that power lines meant access roads, which meant potential help. But 2 miles in this heat, with barely any water left, seemed like crossing an ocean. I found a large boulder with a slight overhang and squeezed myself into the strip of shade it provided. My knees pulled up to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible to fit in the shadow. That's when the real fear set in. The kind that makes your chest tight and your thoughts race in circles. I knew the statistics. People die in the Arizona desert every summer. Experienced hikers, tourists, locals who should know better. The heat kills you slowly, first confusion, then hallucinations, then your organs start shutting down one by one. I rationed my last water bottle into tiny sips, just enough to wet my mouth, and tried to do the math on how long I could last. My phone was at 40% battery, still no signal, and I'd turned off everything except emergency services to conserve power. I took off my long-sleeved hiking shirt and wrapped it around my head like a makeshift turban, sitting there in just my sports bra, not caring about modesty anymore, only survival. The rocks around me radiated heat like an oven, and I could actually see the air shimmering and dancing, creating weird mirages that made distant bushes look like pools of water. Around 1 in the afternoon, with the temperature at 112 degrees according to my dying phone, I made the decision to try for the power lines. Staying put meant certain dehydration, and nobody knew where I was. I hadn't even told anyone which specific trail I was hiking that day, just that I was going out with a hiking group. I tore pages from the small notebook I carried for photography notes and left them weighted down with rocks, arrows pointing in the direction I was heading, just in case someone came looking. My water was down to maybe 3 ounces, sloshing pathetically at the bottom of the bottle, and I'd already decided I would drink it all before starting the walk rather than torture myself with the sound of it. The ground burned through my hiking boots, and within 5 minutes of leaving my boulder shelter, I could feel the sun attacking every exposed inch of skin like thousands of tiny needles. I'd draped my jacket over my shoulders and head, creating a pathetic tent of shade that did almost nothing against the assault of heat from above and below. The 2 miles might as well have been 20. Every few hundred yards, I had to stop and rest, crouching down to make myself smaller against the sun, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth felt like I'd been chewing on cotton, and my tongue was swollen and heavy. Strange thoughts kept flickering through my head. Random memories of ice cream shops, swimming pools, that waterfall shower at the spa I'd visited last year for my birthday. About halfway to the power lines, I stumbled and fell, my palms scraping against the burning rocks, and for a moment I just lay there, wondering if this was how it would end, if some hiker would find my body months from now, mummified by the desert heat. But then I heard it, the distant hum of electricity from the power lines, and even better, the faint sound of an engine. I forced myself up, legs shaking, and stumbled forward, waving my white jacket over my head like a flag, screaming with what little voice I had left, though it came out as more of a croak. It was a utility truck, one of those white pickups with the yellow flashing lights, driving slowly along the access road beneath the power lines. The driver, a guy named Carl who looked about 50 with deeply tanned arms covered in faded tattoos, later told me he almost didn't stop because he thought I was just another desert mirage. But something about the way I was moving, stumbling, and waving that jacket made him hit the brakes. He jumped out of his truck already reaching for his water cooler, and I'll never forget the feeling of that first gulp of cold water. It was like coming back to life, like every cell in my body had been screaming and suddenly went quiet. He poured some over my head and neck, not caring that it was soaking the seats as he helped me into his air-conditioned cab. The thermometer on his dashboard showed 114 degrees outside, and he told me I was lucky. He wasn't supposed to be checking this section until next week, but there'd been reports of copper thieves in the area. Carl drove me straight to the nearest urgent care facility, calling ahead on his radio to let them know he was bringing in someone with heat exhaustion. The nurses hooked me up to IV fluids, and I spent the next 4 hours in a bed with cooling blankets, my core temperature slowly returning to normal while they monitored my kidney function. Frank and the hiking group had realized I was missing when they reached the lunch spot, and had already called search and rescue by the time Carl found me. The doctor, a young woman who'd trained in emergency medicine specifically for desert-related injuries, told me bluntly that another hour or two in that heat without water could have meant organ failure. I still have the scars on my palms from where I fell, pale little reminders that fade a bit more each year. These days, I still photograph the desert, but I never hike alone. I carry 6 liters of water minimum, and I bought a GPS beacon that sends my location to satellites every 10 minutes. That $12 device might seem like overkill to some people, but they didn't spend 3 hours thinking they were going to die alone in the Arizona desert, watching the power lines shimmer in the heat while their bodies slowly shut down. Most people think Montana in October is too cold for backpacking, but that never stopped me from chasing those empty trails when everyone else had packed up for the season. At 32, after spending 6 years guiding tours through Yellowstone, solitude had become my drug of choice. The day everything went sideways started like any other autumn trek. Me, my worn-out Osprey pack, and 40 miles of wilderness between me and the nearest paved road. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness stretched out like a massive graveyard of pine and granite, completely deserted except for the animals preparing for winter. My plan seemed bulletproof. 3 days following Slough Creek up to the plateau, photographing the fall colors and maybe spotting some elk before the heavy snows hit. The ranger at the Cook City station had mentioned increased grizzly activity near the berry patches, but honestly, after years of carrying bear spray and never needing it, those warnings had started to feel like background noise. The spot where everything unraveled sat about 11 miles from the trailhead, tucked between 2 ridges where the creek made this perfect S-curve through a meadow. Setting up camp took longer than usual because the ground had already started to freeze, making it nearly impossible to drive tent stakes deep enough to hold against the wind. By the time my little orange shelter stood ready, darkness had swallowed the valley whole, leaving just the circle of light from my headlamp dancing across the frost-covered grass. Dinner consisted of lukewarm instant ramen eaten straight from the pot, while sitting on a fallen log, watching the stars emerge one by one in that crystal-clear mountain sky. The temperature had already dropped below 20 degrees, and every exhale created these little clouds that hung in the air before dissolving. After hanging my food bag on the bear pole 100 yards from camp, standard procedure that had become muscle memory, exhaustion pulled me into my sleeping bag around 8:30, Way earlier than usual, but typical for solo trips when there's nothing to do after dark. The breathing woke me up somewhere around 2 in the morning, this deep rhythmic huffing that made the tent walls vibrate with each exhale. My first thought jumped straight to grizzly, that distinctive sound of a large predator investigating something new in its territory. Through the thin nylon, maybe 3 feet from where my head rested against the stuff sack I used as a pillow, came the unmistakable noise of something massive shifting its weight from paw to paw. The bear spray sat right next to my sleeping bag, exactly where training had taught me to keep it, and my fingers found the safety tab in the darkness while trying to control my own breathing. Every wilderness course I'd ever taken screamed the same advice. Stay quiet, don't move. Let the bear lose interest and wander away. Bears investigating tents usually just wanted to satisfy their curiosity before moving on to find actual food. But this one started circling, and each footfall sent vibrations through the frozen ground that I could feel in my chest. Then came the pawing, gentle at first, like a dog scratching at a door, testing the strange orange fabric that had appeared in its territory. The tent pole near my feet bent inward as the animal pressed against it, and I could hear claws catching on the rainfly, creating these tiny ripping sounds that made my teeth clench. My headlamp lay within reach, but turning it on would only confirm my presence inside what probably looked like a giant piece of exotic fruit to a hungry bear preparing for hibernation. The circling continued, methodical and patient, occasionally punctuated by these low grunts that sounded almost conversational, like the bear was talking to itself while solving a puzzle. When it pressed its nose against the tent wall near my torso, leaving a wet mark that gleamed in the starlight filtering through the fabric, every instinct screamed at me to run. But running meant unzipping the tent, which would take precious seconds, and stepping directly into the path of an animal that could cover 30 yards faster than I could blink. The moment arrived when the bear hooked its claws through the mesh window near the door and pulled, tearing a 6-inch gash that let in a rush of freezing air, along with the overwhelming smell of wet fur and rotting meat. That smell. God, nothing prepares you for how a grizzly smells up close, like a mixture of dog kennel, compost heap, and something ancient and wild that triggers every evolutionary alarm in your brain. My thumb pressed down on the bear spray trigger, but nothing happened. The safety tab had come off fine, but the mechanism had completely frozen in the sub-zero temperature, leaving me holding a useless canister while staring at a massive brown snout pushing through the tear in my tent. Panic finally won over training, and my body moved before my brain could stop it. Rolling sideways, I grabbed my flashlight and dove for the back of the tent, using my shoulder like a battering ram to burst through the fabric opposite from where the bear stood. The cold hit like jumping into ice water, but adrenaline kept my legs pumping as I sprinted blindly into the darkness, with only the bouncing beam of my flashlight showing glimpses of trees and rocks. Behind me came the sound of the tent being demolished, poles snapping, fabric shredding, my entire camp destroyed in seconds. The bear's roar echoed off the canyon walls, not the comical sound you hear in movies, but something primal that seemed to come from the earth itself. My bare feet, no time for boots, found every sharp rock and frozen stick as I crashed through the underbrush, following the creek downstream because water meant a clear path and maybe, just maybe, a way to mask my scent. The flashlight beam caught the reflection of eyes behind me, definitely following, maybe 40 yards back, moving with that deceptive casualness that grizzlies have when they're not really trying yet. Blood from my torn feet left a perfect trail in the snow that had started falling earlier, each footprint filling with red before the next step. The creek led to a narrow ravine where the walls pressed in close enough that I could touch both sides with outstretched arms. Scrambling over ice-covered boulders, I heard the bear's breathing getting closer, no longer casual but purposeful, like it had decided this chase had gone on long enough. My flashlight started flickering, the batteries struggling in the cold, throwing crazy shadows that made every rock look like another predator waiting to strike. About 50 yards into the ravine, I found what looked like salvation, a cluster of massive boulders creating a narrow gap maybe 2 feet wide, Too small for a full-grown grizzly, but just wide enough for a desperate human. Wedging myself into that crack meant scraping skin off my shoulders and back, but it put solid granite between me and those claws. The bear arrived seconds later, ramming its shoulder against the opening hard enough to shake dust from the rocks above, its frustration evident in the deep growls that reverberated through my hiding spot. For the next 4 hours, until the first gray light of dawn started creeping across the sky, that bear tried everything to reach me. It dug at the base of the rocks, sending showers of gravel into my face. It climbed on top and reached down with paws the size of dinner plates, claws scraping inches from my head when I pressed myself against the back wall. At one point, it left for maybe 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of my life, before returning to resume its siege. The cold had moved beyond painful into a weird numbness where I couldn't feel my feet anymore, and violent shivering made it hard to hold the flashlight steady. Hypothermia whispered seductively about how easy it would be to just close my eyes and sleep, but the occasional swipe of claws kept shocking me back to alertness. Around 5 in the morning, with visibility improving, the bear seemed to lose interest, its sounds growing distant until they faded entirely. Still, I waited another hour before crawling out of that crack, every joint screaming in protest after being locked in the same position for so long. The journey back to what remained of my camp took 3 hours on destroyed feet that had turned purple and black from frostbite. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, leaving bloody prints in the fresh snow that had covered the chaos from the night. The campsite looked like a bomb had gone off. Sleeping bags shredded and scattered across 50 yards, tent poles bent into impossible angles, my backpack torn open with freeze-dried meals and clothing strewn everywhere. The bear had even found my water filter and chewed it into plastic confetti. But my satellite emergency beacon, tucked in a side pocket the bear had missed, still worked. Pressing that SOS button felt like admitting defeat after years of priding myself on wilderness self-sufficiency. But pride means nothing when you're looking at toes that might need amputation. While waiting for rescue, I gathered what remained of my gear, stuffing torn clothing against my feet to stop the bleeding, and discovered something that made my chest tighten: massive paw prints circling the entire meadow, showing the bear had stalked my camp for hours before I woke up. The helicopter arrived just after noon, the search and rescue team's faces shifting from professional calm to genuine concern when they saw the condition of my feet and the devastation around us. During the flight to the hospital in Billings, the paramedic cleaning my wounds mentioned they'd been tracking an aggressive male grizzly in the area, one that had lost fear of humans after too many encounters with careless campers who didn't secure their food properly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd done everything right, followed every protocol, hung my food exactly as trained, and still ended up as another statistic in human-bear encounters. The doctor at the hospital counted 43 separate lacerations on my feet, some deep enough to require stitches, and confirmed 2 toes would need partial amputation from frostbite. Recovery took 2 months of physical therapy and skin grafts, but the mental recovery stretched much longer. Even now, 5 years later, sleeping in a tent triggers nightmares where I wake up gasping, convinced I can hear that distinctive breathing just outside. The investigation that followed revealed details that still make me sick to think about. Rangers found the bear's daybeds less than 200 yards from where I'd camped, meaning it had watched me set up, cook dinner, and crawl into my tent like I was putting myself in a wrapped gift box. The tracks showed it had approached and retreated from my camp at least 4 times before finally committing to the investigation that woke me up. They eventually had to put the bear down 3 weeks later after it charged a group of hunters near Cook City, and the necropsy revealed something disturbing. Its stomach contained human clothing and gear from at least 2 other camps, though no bodies were ever found. The biologist explained that the bear had learned to associate human camps with easy food rewards, probably from years of successfully raiding improperly stored supplies, and had begun seeing tents themselves as food containers to be opened. What saved me, apparently, was pure luck. The ravine I'd stumbled into while running blind was the only geographical feature for miles that could have provided adequate protection from a determined grizzly. These days, I still guide tours through Yellowstone, but something fundamental has changed in how I move through wild spaces. Every snapping twig makes me pause. Every shadow holds potential danger, and I carry 2 cans of bear spray plus a backup that I keep at body temperature to prevent freezing. When clients ask about my pronounced limp or why I wear special boots to accommodate my modified feet, I tell them the story, watching their faces shift from excitement about spotting wildlife to understanding the reality of sharing space with apex predators. The wilderness isn't malicious or evil. That bear was just being a bear, following instincts honed over thousands of years. But it's not our friend either. Not some Disney movie where respect and proper food storage guarantee safety. Sometimes you do everything right and still end up bleeding in the snow, wedged between rocks while 700 pounds of muscle and claws tries to drag you out. That's the truth they don't put in the camping guides. Nature doesn't care about your training, your experience, or your bear spray. When you step into those mountains, you're accepting that contract, walking into something beautiful and terrible that might just decide to remind you where you really stand on the food chain. College was kicking my ass that November, and when my roommate Jason suggested we skip our Friday classes for a hiking trip up near the Cascade foothills, I jumped at the chance. 22 and stressed about finals, I needed to clear my head more than I needed another lecture on European history. We packed his beat-up Ford Ranger with camping gear we had no intention of using, grabbed some energy bars and bottled water from the campus store, and headed out around dawn. The drive took us 3 hours north through small logging towns where the diners still had wood paneling, and the gas stations only had 2 pumps. Jason kept playing the same indie rock playlist he'd been obsessed with since sophomore year, while I watched the city disappear into Douglas firs and mountain ash. The parking area we picked was just a wide spot where the forestry road turned to gravel. Maybe room for 4 or 5 cars, though ours was the only one there when we pulled in around 9 that morning. The trail started behind a wooden sign so weathered you could barely make out the carved letters announcing Ridgeline Trail Number 7. Jason grabbed his backpack while I tied my bootlaces tighter and pulled on the fleece jacket my mom had sent me the previous month. The path was narrow, covered in pine needles that had turned bronze and slippery from the recent rain, and it switched back through trees so thick that even though the sun was out, everything stayed dim and cold underneath the canopy. We'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes, Jason telling me about this girl from his economics class who kept texting him at 2 in the morning, when we came around a cluster of moss-covered boulders and saw something white fluttering against a huge cedar tree about 20 feet ahead. At first I thought it was trash, maybe toilet paper some asshole hiker had left behind. But as we got closer I could see it was a paper mask, one of those cheap Halloween ones you'd buy at a dollar store, pinned to the bark with what looked like a hunting knife. The mask had eye holes cut out, and a creepy smile drawn on with black marker. And underneath it, stabbed through the same knife, was a folded piece of notebook paper. Jason reached for the note before I could tell him maybe we shouldn't touch it, pulling the paper free, while the knife stayed embedded in the tree trunk. He unfolded it, and we both leaned in to read the message written in the same black marker as the smile on the mask. Welcome to the game. Take the mask and find the next one, 50 paces north where the fallen oak makes a bridge. Your time starts now. Jason actually laughed, that nervous kind of laugh he did during horror movies when he was pretending not to be scared, and said it was probably some geocaching thing or maybe a scavenger hunt the local college kids set up. The competitive side of him that made him insufferable during board game nights was already kicking in, and before I could suggest we just leave it alone, he'd yanked the knife out of the tree, grabbed the mask, and started counting paces north. I followed because what else was I going to do? Leave him alone out there? But something about the whole setup made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude or the hiking. Sure enough, 50 paces through the underbrush brought us to a massive oak tree that must have fallen during a storm years ago. its trunk spanning across a small ravine like nature's own bridge. There on the other side, tied to a branch with orange surveyor's tape, was another paper mask, this one with triangular eyes and a frown drawn in red ink. The note attached to this one said, "Good job. You're learning fast. Next mask is at the clearing where 3 trails meet. Follow the deer path behind the big stump." Jason was getting into it now, putting the first mask in his backpack and reaching across the log to grab the second one, talking about how elaborate this whole thing was and wondering what the prize might be at the end. But when I looked around the forest, trying to spot this deer path the note mentioned, I noticed something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. About 30 yards to our left, partially hidden behind a cluster of young hemlocks, someone in camouflage gear was standing perfectly still, watching us. I grabbed Jason's arm hard enough to make him drop the second mask, and when he started to complain, I just pointed with my chin toward where the person was standing. The figure didn't move when we looked directly at them, didn't wave or call out, or do anything normal people do when they're spotted on a trail. Just stayed there like a statue wearing full hunting camo, including one of those face masks that covers everything except the eyes. Jason whispered that it was probably just a hunter, maybe bow season or something. But hunters don't just stand there staring at people, and this person wasn't carrying any visible weapon, just standing with their arms at their sides in a way that seemed completely unnatural. We both stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds before Jason loudly said, "Hey there," and gave a wave that the figure didn't return. That's when I noticed the smell, this thick metallic scent that cut through the normal forest smells of dirt and rotting leaves, and I realized it was coming from somewhere past the fallen oak tree, from the direction the game wanted us to go. Jason must have smelled it too because his whole demeanor changed, that cocky attitude draining away as he took a step backward, nearly slipping on the wet leaves. The figure in camo finally moved then, not toward us but parallel to our position, walking through the trees with slow, deliberate steps that somehow didn't make any of the usual sounds you'd expect from someone moving through underbrush. They stopped again maybe 20 yards away, still watching, and that's when we saw the second person, dressed the same way, standing on the opposite side of the trail we'd come from, effectively putting us between them. Jason grabbed my shoulder and hissed that we needed to get back to the truck right now. Forget the stupid game. And we both turned to head back the way we came, trying to walk fast without actually running because some primitive part of your brain tells you that running triggers the chase. But as we passed the cedar tree where we'd found the first mask, we saw a third figure in camouflage, this one standing right on the trail ahead of us, holding something in their gloved hands that looked like another one of those paper masks. We veered off the trail immediately, crashing through salal bushes and devil's club that tore at our clothes and skin, both of us abandoning any pretense of staying calm. Jason dropped his backpack somewhere in those first panicked minutes, and I could hear him gasping these ragged breaths that matched my own as we stumbled over roots and ducked under low-hanging branches. The worst part was the silence behind us. No shouting, no sounds of pursuit, just our own noisy flight through the forest while those figures were probably moving through the trees like smoke, knowing exactly where we were headed. The truck was our only thought: get to the truck, lock the doors, drive until we hit pavement and cell service and people. Normal people who didn't play twisted games in the woods. We burst out of the tree line into the small parking area after what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes of pure adrenaline-fueled running. And there was the Ford Ranger sitting exactly where we'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. Jason was fumbling for his keys before we even reached it, his hands trembling so bad he dropped them twice in the gravel. But when we got within 10 feet of the truck, we both stopped dead because the ground around it was covered in footprints, dozens and dozens of boot prints in the soft dirt circling the vehicle over and over again, like someone had been walking rounds while we were gone. The prints went around at least 7 or 8 times, maybe more, and in some places you could see where whoever it was had stopped and stood still, the impressions deeper there like they'd been waiting, watching the trail to see when we'd come back. Jason made this sound, Not quite a sob, but close, and practically dove for the driver's side door, jamming the key in the lock so hard I thought he might break it. The doors weren't damaged. The windows were intact. Nothing seemed touched except for those prints and one other thing. Tucked under the windshield wiper was another paper mask. This one with hollow black circles for eyes and no mouth at all. Just smooth white paper where a mouth should be. And written across the forehead in that same black marker were the words, "You didn't finish the game." Jason ripped the mask off the windshield and threw it on the ground. Then we both jumped in the truck and locked the doors so fast the sound echoed off the trees. He turned the key and for one horrible second the engine just clicked. That dead battery sound that makes your soul leave your body. But then it roared to life on the second try and we were moving, gravel spraying everywhere as Jason reversed too fast and nearly hit a tree. As we spun around to face the exit, all three figures emerged from the forest edge at different points, standing in that same unnatural stillness, watching us leave. One of them raised their hand, not in a wave but holding it up like they were showing us something, and even from inside the truck I could see it was another folded piece of paper. Jason floored it down the forestry road, taking the turns way too fast. The truck fishtailing on the loose gravel while I kept looking back expecting to see vehicles following us. But there was nothing, just empty road and dust. We didn't stop or slow down until we hit the main highway 40 minutes later. And even then Jason kept checking the mirrors obsessively, while I called 911 on my finally working phone. The sheriff's deputy who met us at a gas station in the nearest town looked exactly like every small-town cop you've ever seen, thick mustache and skeptical expression included. And I could tell within the first minute of our story that he thought we were full of shit. He took notes about the masks and the people in camouflage, said he'd have someone check the trail, but kept asking if we'd been drinking or taking anything, looking at our pupils with his flashlight, even though it was barely afternoon. When Jason demanded they go up there right now, that those people might still be there, the deputy said something about bow season bringing out all kinds of hunters and how city kids often misinterpret normal forest activity. He gave us his card, said to call if anything else happened, and suggested we head home and get some rest. The drive back to campus took forever, neither of us talking much, just listening to the engine and watching every car that got too close. And when we finally made it to our apartment, Jason went straight to his room and didn't come out for the rest of the weekend. The next Thursday, Jason finally told me he'd been doing research online, finding old news articles about hikers going missing in that area over the years, though nothing recent enough to seem connected to what we'd experienced. He showed me this blog post from 3 years earlier, where someone described finding paper masks on trees during a solo hike. But the post ended abruptly, and the account never updated again. We decided to never talk about it with anyone else after our friends started making jokes about us getting spooked by hunters, calling us paranoid whenever we declined invitations to go camping. But here's the thing that still makes me lock my doors twice every night and avoid hiking altogether. About a month after that trip, right before winter break, I was walking to my car in the campus parking garage when I found something tucked under my wiper. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded exactly like the ones in the forest, and written in that same black marker was a single line: "Games don't end just because you stop playing." I moved apartments the next week, changed my phone number, even transferred to a different school the following semester, telling everyone it was for a better program. That was 4 years ago, and I live in a different state now. Work in an office where the biggest threat is paper cuts and bad coffee. But sometimes I still get this feeling like someone's been in my apartment while I was at work. Nothing stolen or moved. Just this sense that someone stood in my space, breathing my air, waiting. Jason and I don't talk anymore. He dropped out that spring. Last I heard, he was living with his parents and working construction. But about 6 months ago, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize with no subject line and just an attachment. When I opened it against my better judgment, it was a photo of a tree with a paper mask pinned to it, those same hollow eyes and missing mouth, and in the background, blurry but unmistakable, was the apartment building I'd just moved into 3 weeks earlier. I went to the police, but what could I say that didn't sound insane? and what crime had actually been committed anyway. So now I just live with it, changing locks that probably don't matter, avoiding forests I used to love, and wondering if one day I'll come home to find footprints circling my car again. Or worse, finally meet whoever's been playing this game for so much longer than just that one November morning. The mountains of Colorado had been calling me for years, ever since I'd moved there after college. That morning in early February, I woke up in my small apartment in Boulder, checking the weather reports one more time before heading out. A storm system was moving in from the west, but the forecasters said it wouldn't hit until late evening. Plenty of time for me to summit Gray's Peak and get back down. My brother Kevin had texted me the night before, worried about me going solo again, but I'd done this route at least a dozen times in various conditions. The trick with winter mountaineering isn't just knowing the mountain, it's respecting it enough to turn back when things go south. What I didn't know that morning, sipping my black coffee and checking my gear one final time, was that the weather models had gotten it wrong by about 6 hours. My 29th birthday had been just last week, and Kevin kept joking I should start acting more responsible. But the mountains were where I felt most alive. I reached the trailhead around 7 in the morning, the parking area completely empty except for my pickup truck. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -12 degrees Fahrenheit, but with my layers, merino wool base, insulated middle, and my trusted red shell jacket, I felt prepared. My pack contained all the essentials: extra batteries for my GPS, energy bars, 2 liters of water in insulated bottles, emergency bivvy, headlamp, and my avalanche beacon. I'd even thrown in chemical hand warmers as backup. The first 2 miles went smoothly, my crampons biting into the packed snow as I followed the summer trail route. The sky above showed that deceptive winter blue that makes you think everything's going to be fine, but I noticed the wind picking up earlier than expected, sending small snow devils spinning across the exposed sections of trail. Around 9:30, I reached the tree line where the real climb begins. The temperature had dropped even further, and ice crystals formed on my beard every time I exhaled. My GPS showed I was making good time, about 3 miles in with another 4 to the summit. The device had been acting sluggish in the cold, taking longer to refresh my position, but I didn't think much of it. I'd memorized this route anyway, knew every switchback and false summit. The ridge ahead looked pristine, untouched snow gleaming like crushed diamonds in the morning sun. I stopped to eat an energy bar and drink some water, making sure to keep the bottles inside my jacket between sips so they wouldn't freeze. That's when I noticed the clouds building on the western horizon, dark and heavy, moving faster than they should have been. The weather apps on my phone still showed the storm arriving around 8 that evening, but those clouds told a different story. By the time I reached the final approach to the summit ridge, around 11, the sky had transformed completely. What had been crystal blue was now a threatening gray, and the wind had gone from annoying to genuinely concerning, gusting hard enough to knock me sideways if I wasn't careful. My GPS screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black. The cold had killed it, despite the extra batteries warming in my chest pocket. I pulled out my phone to use as backup navigation, but the battery indicator showed only 15%. The cold was draining it faster than I'd ever seen. I managed to send one quick message to Kevin, almost at the summit. The message showed delivered just before the screen went dark. No GPS, no phone, and those clouds were moving in like a wall of static on an old television, eating up the valley below me. I could maybe make the summit in 30 minutes, but getting down would take at least 3 hours in good conditions, and these weren't going to be good conditions much longer. The smart move would have been to turn around right then, use the remaining visibility to get below tree line before the storm hit. But I kept thinking about that message to Kevin, almost at the summit, and how close I actually was. Pride is a dangerous thing on a mountain. I decided to push for the summit, telling myself I'd just tag it quickly and head straight back down. The wind was howling now, probably 40 miles per hour with stronger gusts, and the first snowflakes started hitting my goggles like tiny needles. Within 10 minutes, those few flakes had become a complete whiteout. I couldn't see more than 15 feet in any direction, and the wind-driven snow had already started filling in my tracks from the way up. The summit cairn appeared suddenly out of the white void, just a pile of frozen rocks that meant nothing now except that I'd made it. No celebration, no photos, just the immediate realization that I'd made a potentially fatal mistake. The descent started bad and got worse fast. Without GPS, I had to rely on terrain features to navigate. But in a whiteout, every snow-covered rock looks the same. I knew I needed to follow the ridge northeast for about a quarter mile before turning down the eastern face. But after 5 minutes of walking, I had no idea if I'd gone 50 feet or 500. The wind was so loud I couldn't even hear my own breathing, just this constant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My goggles kept fogging and freezing over, forcing me to clear them every few steps. That's when I noticed my fingers weren't working quite right, the early stages of frostbite setting in despite my insulated gloves. I'd been out in the cold too long, moving too slowly, and my body was starting to shut down the extremities to preserve core heat. Every mountaineer knows that once frostbite starts, you're on borrowed time. I made the decision to stop moving and dig in. The alternative was wandering blind off a cliff or into an avalanche zone. Using my ice axe and what strength I had left, I carved out a small depression in the lee side of what felt like a large boulder, though I couldn't actually see it properly through the storm. The emergency bivy sack from my pack took 3 tries to open with my fumbling fingers, and getting inside it while wearing crampons in that wind was like trying to fold myself into an envelope during a hurricane. Once inside, I pulled out the chemical hand warmers I'd packed, cracking them and shoving them into my gloves and boots. The relief was immediate, but I knew it was temporary. These would only last a few hours. My watch showed it was just past noon. If the storm followed the original forecast and cleared by evening, I might have a chance. If it lasted through the night, the math became much simpler and much worse. The survival statistics for overnight exposure at 14,000 feet in a blizzard aren't something you want to think about when you're living them. Inside the bivy sack with the wind screaming just inches from my face, I had time to really consider my situation. Search and rescue wouldn't even start looking until tomorrow at the earliest. Kevin would assume I was hunkered down somewhere safe for the night when I didn't check in. The mountain rescue teams don't deploy in conditions like these anyway. It would just add more casualties. My choices had narrowed to 2 equally terrible options: stay put and hope I could survive 18 to 20 hours in sub-zero temperatures with minimal shelter, or try to descend blind through terrain that killed experienced climbers even in good weather. The eastern face had several cliff bands that required careful route finding and perfect visibility. One wrong turn and I'd walk straight off a 100-foot drop. But staying put meant fighting hypothermia all night, with just a thin bivy sack between me and the kind of cold that stops hearts. I could already feel it creeping in. That drowsy warmth that isn't warmth at all, but your body lying to you as it shuts down. Then I remembered something from an avalanche course I'd taken years ago, the instructor talking about terrain navigation in whiteouts. He'd mentioned following fall lines, how water and gravity never lie about which way is down. If I could find the natural drainage of the slope and follow it carefully, testing each step with my ice axe, I might be able to descend without walking off a cliff. It was still insanely risky, but it gave me something better than blind wandering. I forced myself out of the bivy sack, the wind immediately trying to rip it from my numb hands as I stuffed it back in my pack. The hand warmers had helped enough that I could grip my ice axe properly, though I couldn't feel my toes anymore. I started probing the snow ahead of me, feeling for the subtle dip that would indicate the natural fall line of the slope. Each step became a ritual: probe with the axe, test the snow stability, shift my weight forward, repeat. Time lost all meaning in that white void. I could have been moving for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The first cliff band announced itself when my ice axe suddenly found nothing but air. I'd been shuffling forward in my careful rhythm when the axe just dropped, nearly pulling me forward with it. I jerked back, heart hammering, and sat down hard in the snow. In clear weather, I knew there was a way around this cliff to the north, maybe 200 yards along the ridge. But 200 yards in a whiteout might as well be 200 miles. I started traversing left, keeping the drop on my right, using it as my only reference point in the featureless white. That's when I heard it, or thought I heard it through the wind. A sound like thunder, but wrong somehow, coming from above me. My brain took a second to process what that sound meant at 14,000 feet in a blizzard. Avalanche. Somewhere upslope, tons of snow had cut loose and were heading down. In a whiteout, I couldn't see where it was coming from or which way to run. Training kicked in before conscious thought. I drove my ice axe deep into the snow and wrapped the leash around my wrist, then dropped flat and dug my crampons in, making myself as small and anchored as possible. The rumbling grew louder, the ground vibrating beneath me, and then the air pressure changed, that distinctive whoosh of displaced air that comes right before impact. The avalanche hit me from the left side, not the massive wall of snow I'd feared, but the edge of the slide, powder blast and chunks of ice that slammed into me like a frozen waterfall. For maybe 10 seconds I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but hold on to that axe while the mountain tried to tear me loose. When it passed, I was buried up to my waist, but still anchored, still alive. My pack had been partially torn off, hanging by one strap, and my goggles were completely gone. The avalanche had actually done me one favor. It had scoured away the loose snow on the slope, revealing older, harder-packed snow beneath that showed the actual shape of the terrain. Through the still driving snow, I could make out darker shapes that had to be rock outcroppings, giving me reference points for the first time in hours. The rest of the descent became a blur of controlled terror and small victories. Using those exposed rocks as guides, I managed to navigate around 2 more cliff bands, though the second one required a horrible traverse across a 45-degree slope that creaked ominously under my weight. My feet had gone from numb to burning, paradoxically a good sign that blood flow was returning, though I knew I'd lose at least a few toes to frostbite. Around 3 in the afternoon, according to my watch, I literally stumbled into the tree line. The sudden appearance of a gnarled pine tree making me cry with relief inside my frozen face mask. The trees meant I was below 12,000 feet, out of the death zone, though still far from safe. The storm continued for another 4 hours as I picked my way down through the forest, following the drainage that I knew eventually led to the trail. By the time I reached my truck, it was dark, my headlamp barely penetrating the still falling snow. The engine took 3 tries to start, and I had to scrape ice from the inside of the windshield before I could drive. My fingers were too damaged to work my phone, so I drove straight to the emergency room in Georgetown, stumbling through the doors looking like something from a horror movie. Ice-covered, bloodshot eyes, and unable to speak clearly through my swollen, frostbitten lips. The final tally from that day: I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right to frostbite, along with the tip of my ring finger. The doctor said I was lucky. Another hour out there, and I would have lost both feet entirely, if not my life. Kevin drove down from Denver that night, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked into that hospital room, this mixture of relief and fury that only a sibling can manage. He didn't say, "I told you so," but he didn't have to. The storm ended up lasting 36 hours, dumping 4 feet of snow, and claiming the lives of 2 other climbers on different peaks that same day. The search and rescue coordinator who visited me later said they wouldn't have even started looking for me until day 3, and by then they would have been looking for a body. What haunts me most isn't the pain or the permanent damage to my feet that ended my serious climbing days. It's the knowledge that every single decision I made that day was wrong, that my experience and confidence had become arrogance, and that the mountain had given me a lesson I barely survived learning. I still live in Colorado, still look at those peaks every morning from my apartment window, but I don't climb anymore. Not like before. Sometimes I take easy summer hikes on well-marked trails, always with a group, always turning back at the first sign of weather. People ask if I miss it, the real mountaineering, the challenge of winter ascents. The truth is, I do miss it every single day. But I also remember the taste of my own mortality in that blizzard. The way my body betrayed me in the cold, and the terrible randomness of surviving when others didn't. The mountains are still beautiful, still calling, but now I know what that call really is. Not an invitation, but a warning. My frostbite scars ache when the temperature drops, a permanent reminder written in damaged nerve endings and missing flesh. Some lessons you carry in your mind, others you carry in your body. This one, I carry in both. Every parent thinks they're prepared for the worst until it actually happens, and that Saturday in early June changed everything about how I see the wilderness. My accounting firm in Eugene had given me a long weekend off, and I'd been taking groups into the Oregon backcountry since my college days as a wilderness guide, which meant I knew these trails better than most people know their own neighborhoods. My son Nathan had just turned 14 that spring, and he'd been begging me to take him and his buddies on a real backpacking trip, not just the day hikes we usually did around town. The boys had finished 8th grade the week before, and this was supposed to be their celebration before high school started in the fall. Nathan's friends, Bradley and Josh, were good kids I'd known since they were in elementary school together. Both from families who trusted me enough to sign the permission slips without asking too many questions about the overnight camping part. We'd chosen a section of trail in the Cascade Range that I knew inside out, a moderate 15-mile loop that would challenge the boys without putting them in any real danger. Bradley was the joker of the group, constantly making the other two laugh with impressions of their teachers and ridiculous commentary about everything we passed on the trail, while Josh was quieter, more observant, always pointing out interesting plants or rock formations and asking me questions about the ecosystem. Nathan fell somewhere in between his friends, trying to act mature and responsible since his dad was there, but still breaking into giggles whenever Bradley did something particularly absurd. The weather forecast had been perfect, clear skies and temperatures in the low 70s, and we'd made good time that morning, covering about 6 miles before stopping for lunch near a creek crossing around noon. The boys were in high spirits talking about their plans for summer, the girls they had crushes on, and arguing about which video game they'd play first when they got home Sunday night. The creek where we stopped was running higher than usual from the late spring snowmelt, crystal clear water rushing over smooth granite rocks that had been polished by centuries of flow. Josh had finished his sandwich first and was already crouched by the water's edge, filling his bottle, while Bradley tried to balance on a fallen log that stretched halfway across the stream. Nathan was helping me collect the trash from lunch, stuffing granola bar wrappers into the designated garbage bag we'd pack out, when Bradley announced he needed to refill his water bottle too. All 3 boys had those fancy filtered bottles their parents had bought specifically for this trip, the kind that could supposedly clean any water source, though I'd still insisted we stick to running streams just to be safe. The sound of the creek was loud enough that we had to raise our voices slightly to talk, which is probably why none of us noticed exactly when Josh stood up from the water's edge and walked back toward the trees. Bradley was still messing around on his log, pretending to be a tightrope walker and making Nathan laugh, when I did a quick head count and came up 1 short. The space where Josh had been crouching by the creek was empty, just his water bottle cap sitting on a rock where he'd left it. My first thought was that he'd gone behind a tree to take a leak, which was perfectly normal, so I called out his name in that casual way parents do when they're not really worried yet. No answer came back, just the constant rush of water over rocks and Bradley asking what was wrong. Nathan immediately picked up on the change in my voice and started scanning the tree line, while Bradley hopped off his log and jogged over to where Josh had been. The forest around us was thick with Douglas firs and hemlocks, their trunks creating a maze of shadows even in the midday sun, but visibility was still decent for about 30 yards in most directions. The next 10 minutes shifted from mild concern to genuine worry as we spread out in different directions, calling Josh's name with increasing volume and urgency. Bradley found the first tracks about 20 feet from where Josh had been filling his water bottle, clear boot prints in the soft dirt heading back toward the main trail we'd come from. The prints were definitely Josh's, matching the distinctive waffle pattern of his new hiking boots that his mom had bought him specifically for this trip. We followed them together, the three of us moving quickly but carefully, expecting to find Josh around every bend, maybe sitting on a rock checking his phone or taking pictures of something interesting he'd spotted. But the tracks kept going, weaving between trees in an oddly purposeful way, like he'd been following something or someone, though we hadn't seen another soul on the trail all morning. About 200 yards from the creek, right where the trail curved around a massive boulder covered in moss, the footprints simply stopped, as if Josh had been lifted straight up into the air. Nathan was the first to start genuinely panicking, his voice cracking as he called out for Josh over and over, while Bradley kept insisting this had to be some elaborate prank, that Josh was probably hiding behind a tree waiting to jump out and scare us. But I knew Josh wasn't that kind of kid, never had been in all the years I'd known him, and the way those tracks just ended made every hair on my arm stand straight up. I pulled out my phone to check for signal, knowing it was unlikely but hoping maybe I could call for help. But the screen showed exactly what I expected. No service, not even a single bar. The GPS on my phone was acting strange too, showing our location jumping around erratically, placing us sometimes miles away from where we actually stood. My old compass, the one my father had given me 20 years ago when I first started hiking, was spinning lazily in circles when I pulled it from my pack, the needle refusing to settle on magnetic north or any direction at all. The afternoon sun was already starting to angle through the trees when I made the decision to search in a grid pattern, keeping Nathan and Bradley within sight at all times while we methodically covered the area around where the tracks disappeared. Every few minutes I'd blow the emergency whistle attached to my pack, 3 short bursts followed by 3 long ones, the universal distress signal I'd taught all 3 boys at the start of our hike. Bradley had gone quiet, no more jokes or attempts to lighten the mood, just mechanically calling Josh's name every 30 seconds, like some kind of broken recording. Nathan stayed close to me, close enough that I could hear his breathing getting more ragged with each passing minute, and I kept putting my hand on his shoulder to reassure him, even though I felt anything but reassured myself. We must have covered every square foot of forest within a quarter-mile radius, checking behind fallen logs, inside the hollow base of an old-growth cedar, even looking up into the canopy in case Josh had somehow decided to climb a tree, though that made no logical sense whatsoever. Around 4 in the afternoon, just as I was preparing to make the difficult decision to hike back to the trailhead and get professional help, we heard it. 3 short whistles followed by 3 long ones, exactly the pattern I'd demonstrated that morning, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Nathan grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, his eyes wide with hope and terror mixed together, while Bradley started shouting Josh's name so loudly that his voice cracked and went hoarse. The whistles came again, maybe 300 yards away, though the acoustic properties of the forest made it impossible to pinpoint the exact direction. We crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, no longer worried about staying on the trail or keeping quiet, branches scratching our arms and faces as we pushed through sections of thick salal and rhododendron. But every time we thought we were getting closer, the whistles would come from a different direction, sometimes behind us, sometimes to our left or right, always maintaining that same perfect pattern I'd taught them. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Darkness came faster than it should have in early June. Or maybe it just felt that way because we were deep under the canopy, chasing those whistles like they were pulling us on invisible strings. I finally had to make the call to stop pursuing the sounds and focus on our own safety, even though it felt like abandoning Josh, like giving up on him when he might be just beyond the next cluster of trees. Nathan was stumbling with exhaustion, and Bradley had gone completely silent except for occasional whimpers he probably didn't even realize he was making. I set up our emergency shelter in a small clearing, just a basic tarp configuration that would keep the dew off us, though none of us had any intention of actually sleeping. The temperature dropped faster than the forecast had predicted, going from comfortable to requiring our fleece jackets in less than an hour, and I distributed the extra food I'd packed, though nobody had any appetite. Throughout it all, those whistles continued, sometimes distant like they were miles away, other times so close it seemed like Josh should be standing right next to us. But we never saw anything, not even a shadow moving between the trees. The longest night of my life was measured in those whistles, which came exactly every 17 minutes according to my watch, never varying by more than a few seconds. Always that same mechanical precision that made my chest tight with dread. Bradley finally broke around midnight, sobbing into his hands about how Josh's parents were going to hate him forever, how this was all his fault for suggesting this stupid trip in the first place, while Nathan sat pressed against my side, trembling but trying to be brave in that heartbreaking way kids do, when they're terrified but don't want to show it. I kept the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the clearing, telling myself I was looking for Josh, but really just needing to see that nothing was approaching us from the darkness. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the whistle stopped mid-pattern, cutting off after just 2 short blasts, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. First light came as a relief so intense I actually felt my muscles unclench for the first time in hours, and I immediately started breaking down our makeshift camp while the boys sat huddled together, neither of them speaking or meeting my eyes. The hike back to the trailhead took less than 2 hours, though it felt like days, with both boys practically jogging despite their exhaustion, desperate to get back to civilization and away from those woods. My truck was still the only vehicle in the small gravel parking area, covered in pine needles and morning dew, like it had been there for weeks instead of just one night. I drove straight to the ranger station in town, not even stopping when Bradley threw up out the window halfway there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The Rangers mobilized faster than I expected, calling in a search and rescue team from the county, dogs, even a helicopter that would arrive within the hour, and they separated us for individual statements while one ranger stayed with the boys and gave them hot chocolate and blankets even though it wasn't cold anymore. The lead ranger, a woman named Teresa who'd probably seen more lost hikers than she could count, pulled me aside after the search teams had deployed and showed me something on her computer that made my whole body go numb. The trail register data showed no other hiking permits had been issued for that section of forest in the past 4 days, and the motion-activated wildlife cameras they had stationed along the main trail confirmed it. Nobody else had entered or exited that area except our group. They found Josh 8 hours later, sitting calmly on a log about 50 feet from where we'd eaten lunch, his water bottle full, his clothes clean, with no memory of anything past kneeling by the creek to fill up his bottle. The medical evaluation found nothing wrong with him physically or mentally, just a blank gap where the last 20 hours should have been, and when they asked him about the whistles, he looked confused and said he didn't know the emergency signal because he'd been tying his bootlace when I'd demonstrated it that morning, which his parents confirmed was exactly the kind of thing Josh would do, always distracted at crucial moments. The investigation went on for another 2 weeks, with rangers and even some federal forestry officials combing through every inch of that trail, but they never found any explanation for what happened that day. Josh's parents were just grateful to have him back safe, though they politely declined when I offered to pay for therapy sessions, saying they'd handle it as a family, and I understood the unspoken message that they blamed me, even if they were too kind to say it out loud. Bradley and Nathan never talked about that night, not to each other, not to their parents, not even to me, though Nathan started sleeping with his light on and quit the wilderness club at school the following fall. The official report listed it as a case of temporary disorientation, possibly caused by dehydration or mild heat exhaustion, completely ignoring the 20 hours Josh was missing, the malfunctioning compass and GPS, and those perfectly timed whistles that none of us could explain. I sold all my camping gear at a yard sale that July, told people I was just too busy with work to keep up with hiking. But the truth is I can't even drive past a forest without remembering those sounds echoing through the trees, always exactly 17 minutes apart, always in that pattern Josh swore he never learned. 6 months later, I ran into Josh's mother at the grocery store, and she pulled me aside near the frozen food section, her voice barely above a whisper as she told me something that made my knees nearly buckle right there next to the ice cream freezers. Josh had started whistling in his sleep about a month after the incident, the exact same pattern we'd heard in the woods, and when she tried to wake him during these episodes, he'd sit up with his eyes wide open but completely unfocused, continuing to whistle for exactly 17 minutes before lying back down with no memory of it in the morning. She'd taken him to specialists in Portland, even a neurologist at the university hospital, but every test came back normal, no sign of trauma or abnormality in his brain. Just a 13-year-old kid who sometimes whistled a distress signal he insisted he'd never learned. They moved to California that winter, something about a job opportunity for Josh's father. But I knew the real reason, the same reason I'd started looking at accounting jobs in other states, far from any mountains or forests. The last thing she said to me before hurrying away with her cart was that Josh had stopped the whistling after they'd crossed the state line, just stopped completely, like whatever had been causing it couldn't follow them that far. And I wanted to feel relieved for them, but all I could think about was Nathan, still living 3 blocks away from me, and whether distance really mattered to whatever we'd encountered out there in those woods.